Thank you very much. All of you have been very helpful. And I'm going to start with you, Mr. Ford. You were, from 2017 to 2020, Chief of Criminal Investigations at the IRS. Is that correct?
Correct.
So recently we learned about how this particular part of the IRS collaborated with other law enforcement agencies on the biggest fentanyl distribution takedown in American history. Hundreds of arrests, seizure of millions and millions of dollars, 850 kilograms of drugs. I mean, this was the equivalent of millions of lethal doses of fentanyl. And the office that you headed up was a key part of enforcement efforts from 2017 to 2020. So House Republicans now want to cut these IRS enforcement measures that we included by over $45 billion. Now, they swear up and down that they're for law enforcement, but with respect to the people, the agents, we should be doing more with less. So when it comes to investigating complex financial crimes, the kind of work you did, the kind of work recently that the office where you were was part of this whole effort, what are the implications of trying to go along with this Republican mantra of, in the criminal area, doing more with less?
Thank you for the question, Chairman Wyden. As I mentioned in my opening statement, IRS criminal investigation has very broad jurisdiction of tax crimes, but also, as you mentioned and I mentioned in my opening comments, in a very important relationship with the Department of Justice and other federal agencies investigating child exploitation, narcotics trafficking, the opioid epidemic. Less money, less funding means less cases. And for the criminal side of the IRS, that means less tax cases, less sophisticated international tax cases, but also less involvement in the cases that you mentioned, these critical involvement with U.S. law enforcement investigating serious narcotics crimes, including the opioid epidemic, terrorist financing, sanctions investigations, and a whole host of other priorities for U.S. law enforcement.
Let me ask you about another one, and that is offshore tax evasion. I'm very pleased that our investigative staff exposed just how a few American families were hiding hundreds of millions of dollars at Credit Suisse, and how one U.S. software executive managed to hide an astounding $2 billion in income offshore for more than a decade. Part of the reason why is Republican budget cuts hamstrung this enforcement program for the get-go. In 2021, there were just 7 criminal investigations opened into offshore bank account violations. That number strikes me as preposterously low. Preposterously low, given the magnitude of offshore tax evasion out there, which has been estimated at about $15 billion per year. Again, let's hear about how the Republican mantra, doing more for less, is going to help us figure out where these wealthy tax cheats are hiding money offshore. It doesn't seem to me that what the Republicans are talking about is going to be helpful as we try to get the very people that we recently exposed.
So it's another great question. There's tremendous work left to be done on international tax enforcement on the criminal side and the civil side. Again, this work is critically important to what the IRS does. There are more cases than the 7 that you cited. There's many international cases, but there's so much more work to be done. And in cooperation with the civil side of the IRS, there are sophisticated schemes. More and more, it's very typical for IRS criminal investigations to involve some type of an international component. These cases are incredibly manpower intensive. They're typically multi-agency investigations led by the Department of Justice that require legal process to get evidence and witnesses from overseas. So there's a lot more investment that can be made and many more cases that can be worked in this area.
Let me ask one question of Dr. Sarin. We've appreciated all of the input on issues you've given us over the years. What do you think about this idea of auditing wealthy tax cheats, and somehow the Republican argument is going to get it done with the IRS doing more with less? We've had now 2 specific examples, this huge fentanyl takedown, the Credit Suisse effort that Mr. Ford has talked about, talking about doing more with less. What do you think the consequences of these cuts are in our effort to really go after the issue that you and others have been looking at for years, which is we've got the information on middle-class people. You know, they pay taxes with every paycheck. It's these wealthy tax cheats we've got to zero in on. Your thoughts about doing more with less, as the Republicans are talking about?
Yeah, thanks, Chairman Wyden. The reality is the IRS can't do more with less. And let me give you another precise example with respect to complex partnerships. In 2019, the IRS opened audits of 7,500 partnerships. It received more than 4 million partnership returns. That is an audit rate of 0.05%. The reality is this is a signal to taxpayers that the IRS is simply outgunned. It has no capacity, and those who want to evade do so freely. What these resources are going to mean for the IRS and what not having these resources will mean for the IRS is that finally the agency is going to have the capacity to hire the people required to pour through thousands of pages of incredibly complex structured tiered partnerships that are owned by tiered partnerships and designed as such precisely to be opaque in ways that are impossible to pierce and allow for evasion.
Thank you very much. All of you have been excellent. I'm just going to close with this. I'm over my time. But Mr. Sepp talked about guardrails. We're all for guardrails. What I think you have said, Mr. Fort, and you have said, Dr. Sarin, is that McCarthy budget would do a lot more to unravel our ability to take down the wealthiest tax cheats. It's not about guardrails in that McCarthy budget. It's about unraveling the ability to take them down. Senator Thune.
Mr. Chairman.